good listeners. We're here with another episode of Tales from the Mennonite Heritage Archives, where we share stories about people, places, and events from Mennonite history. I'm your host, Dan Dick. Thanks for tuning in. Today we bring you part 2 of a conversation I had with Dr. Mark Jantzen back in January of 2026. Mark shared with us the little-known history of Mennonites in Prussia. He's a professor of history at Bethel College in Kansas and the author of a book titled Mennonite German Soldiers, Nation, Religion, and Family in the Prussian East. He also finds time to co-direct the Mennonite Polish Studies Association. To get the most out of this episode, I recommend listening to part 1 first. Here now is part 2 of our conversation. When Mennonites later moved to Russia, they received a number of allowances or privileges around things like taxation and holding land and exemption from military service. We already know now that one reason they went to Prussia was because they could baptize as adults. What other privileges might they have acquired in Prussia?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, politically, when Mennonites arrived and they're renting land and getting settled, they didn't have privileges. They just had an agreement. You can live here. And then, this Catholic bishop or that nobleman or this city council would say, oh, we hate Mennonites, so we should get rid of them. And then, others who would say, well, one of two things would happen. Some other power center would say, no, Mennonites are really useful because they're on my land and they're paying taxes and they're very productive. So they'd have this argument, do we keep Mennonites, do we let them go? Or the second thing that would happen is a power center would say, you're talking about my Mennonites? This is none of your business. Go mind your own fields. Like if you want to kick out Mennonites, kick them out on your land and you take the economic hit, but leave mine alone. And Mennonites would know about these conversations and advocate on their behalf, and sometimes they'd gather money and grease the wheels with gifts or bribes. But they figured out pretty quickly, and it started because they're renting land from the crown, that it would be useful to have a royal charter of privilege. So the oldest one we have that we can lay our hands on is from 1642, but it says, I'm granting you the privileges given by an earlier king that goes all the way back to the middle of the 1500s. So Mennonites were getting royal protection, and those charters basically just said, religious freedom, live your life, you're fine. They didn't really enumerate a lot of things. But that was always a backstop that Mennonites or their supporters could pull out whenever these discussions came up. Well, the king is fine with us. Like, why are you bothering us? So as long as they lived under a Prussian king, it was kind of a decentralized thing, and that was helpful. So they had all of that in place long before anybody was thinking about ever moving to Russia.
When and why did the Mennonites begin to leave Prussia for Russia?
To understand why Mennonites left Prussia and moved to Russia, we have to, first of all, talk a little bit about Prussia as a geographic area was kind of divided into two halves. The eastern part was called Ducal Prussia. It was ruled by a Duke of Prussia. Western part was called Royal Prussia because so much of the land in Royal Prussia belonged to the crown, who then rented it out to Mennonites and others. And the Duke of Prussia, in the early 1600s, took the Duchy of Prussia out of Poland. He no longer had to listen to Polish king. He made it like a little independent duchy. And then he died without heirs. And he wrote in his will that if that happens, the Duchy of Prussia will be given as an inheritance to the Elector of Brandenburg. And the Elector of Brandenburg is a territory around Berlin. And the Elector of Brandenburg is like one of the top most important noblemen in the Holy Roman Empire. So it falls to the Elector of Brandenburg. And then when we get to the very late 1600s, the man who was the Elector of Brandenburg, his name was Frederick III, Elector of Brandenburg. But he's also the Duke of Prussia. And he has this idea, I would like to be a king. So sometimes we run into politicians who want to be a king. He goes to Königsberg, the capital of Ducal Prussia, has a coronation ceremony where he puts the crown on his head and he says, "My name is now Frederick the King in Prussia." Because he's not allowed to be a king in Berlin because the Holy Roman Emperor says, there's no kings in my empire.
I'll just make myself king.
Yeah, he just makes himself king. Goes over to Königsberg, makes himself king. When he goes back home, he's got to take off the king crown and just be the elector. Well, several decades later, because king is such a better title than elector, they start to call themselves the king of Prussia. So now the geography of Prussia gets attached to the ruling house in Brandenburg. And this is a much bigger, more important state. So now the state is called Prussia, and it includes Ducal Prussia and Brandenburg and all the other territory that goes with it. And that becomes then the Kingdom of Prussia. So that happened the king thing happened in 1701. By the time we get to the 1770s, the king of Prussia, this time it's a man named Frederick II, comes up with this idea, and he checks with the ruler of Russia, Catherine II, and the ruler of Austria, Maria Theresa. They had been fighting wars against each other, and he's like, "Hey, let's make up, and why don't we all get together and just partition Poland?" So starting in 1772 until 1795, those three states, Russia, Austria, and Prussia, divide in three stages, divide up Poland between them, and just Poland disappears from the map. So after 1795, you look for Poland, and it's like, what? There's no Poland. There's just a Russian Empire and an Austrian Empire and a Kingdom of Prussia. So the King of Prussia, he really wants Royal Prussia because he can now connect Ducal Prussia to his territory to the west of Royal Prussia. So he puts it all together, and he's got a nice continuous piece of land, and it's all Prussian.
And controllable.
Yes. And he doesn't have to worry about Poles, and he's got new land, he's got new taxpayers and more money, and he's super happy. Now, the Mennonites have to figure out how to live under a new king, because obviously their royal charter of privilege from a Polish king is worthless, and the power centers have all changed. So the Kingdom of Prussia is much more centralized. There's only a single person to talk to now. You can't negotiate among a bunch of different power centers. So they get a charter of privileges out of this king, Frederick II, that grants them everything they had in Poland, but they have to pay a communal tax every year to stay out of the military. So the Mennonites sit down and decide, here's how much every Mennonite is going to pay. They organize it through the congregations, and then they funnel it to a central treasurer, and he gets the money deposited with the royal treasurer, and then they're released from the obligation to be registered for military service. There's not really a draft yet, but the Prussian government keeps a registry of all their people to see who could be eligible if they need somebody. And Mennonites aren't even listed on that thing.
Here's where we get into this very weird area of where Mennonite women are not allowed to inherit.
Yes. So the registration list for military service is not kept by people, by men. It's kept by property, by farmsteads. So the Prussian officials have to know this farm is owned by Mennonites, and therefore nobody that lives there is eligible for military service. So military service is tied to a farmstead and not to an individual.
And they don't like that they're not eligible for military service.
The Prussian officials are not happy about that, but Mennonites pay their taxes, and it's all supposed to be okay. Independently of that military service thing, Prussian officials on their own initiate a new restriction that Mennonites say is counter to the Charter of Privileges, but they lose that argument in court. And this new restriction is you can't buy property without a Prussian official's approval because it involves this taking things on and off of the registration for the draft list. And it only takes them a decade or two to decide, basically, it's a little more complicated, but basically Mennonites can't buy real estate unless they buy it from another Mennonite. So you can never buy a farm from a Lutheran for your second son. And the result of that, so 1772, this gets imposed. By 1788, people are leaving for Chortitza. So over this issue, Chortitza colony gets founded in the 1780s. Then when we get up to 1801, it's not that much later, Prussian officials, there's a new king, he orders a review of Mennonite policy, they come up with all kinds of different stuff, and then they decide we still have too many Mennonites, and we don't like that they don't serve. And so the proposal from one of the officials is let's target Mennonite marriages, let's make those more complicated, and the way more difficult, and that's the pressure point. And the policy they come up with says, 1801, this is published as law, it applies only to Mennonites living in the geographic area of Prussia. And it says you can only pass real estate, a farm basically, or a business, you can only pass that on to a legitimate male heir. So now you think about if you own a house, do you have a legitimate male heir that you can pass that on to? They're the only people who could acquire it. So if you're a house full of daughters, you don't qualify. There's no way for you to keep that farm and stay Mennonite. Or if we know from a census that was done when the Prussians took this over, that I think it's about 8% of all Mennonite households were headed by women because of the fatality rates back then. Men died and leave widows behind with kids. And so that was common. But all of those widows could not marry a Mennonite and stay Mennonite and keep their farm. So the law was written, if you agree to be registered for the military, you can do whatever you want with your property. But if you don't, you can't. So if a widow would marry a Mennonite, who then had to become eligible for the draft or registered for military service, the elders would say, well, if you're willing to serve in the military, you're not a Mennonite. So especially the women, the family with female landowners, were really caught. There was no way for them to keep both land and their Mennonite faith. And so that was passed into law in 1801, and Molochna colony gets founded in 1803. And that was the impetus for a lot of people to say, we just now have to get out of here. So the government targeted Mennonite women, wanted to hive them off from the community, and the community's response was, we're all going to stick together, and we just rather move by the hundreds of families to Russia than put up with this Prussian oppressive legal system. So that's kind of the origins of Molochna colony.
Mark, this has been a most interesting conversation. Thank you so much for taking the time to chat and for your work on this lesser-known period of Mennonite history.
Thank you so much for having me in this conversation. It's been great.
That concludes our two-part series with Dr. Mark Jantzen on the little-known history of Mennonites in Prussia. The Mennonite Heritage Archives holds related materials such as immigration records for Mennonites moving from Prussia to Canada after World War II, microfilm of a number of Prussian Mennonite church registers, the Gerhard Wiebe diary from the late 1700s, and family genealogies. To hear this episode again or revisit any of our previous stories, visit mharchives.ca. What are you taking away from this show? Let us know by sending a comment via email to info@mharchives.ca.
Hello, I'm Archivist Conrad Stace. The Mennonite Heritage Archives is a community-supported memory center that relies on donations from community members like you. To support this program and the preservation of Mennonite history, visit mharchives.ca and click on Support, or give us a call at 204-560-1998. Thanks also to our partners, Canadian Mennonite University, the Centre for Transnational Mennonite Studies, Mennonite Church Canada, and Golden West Radio.
In an upcoming episode, we'll bring you the compelling story of Adina Jantzen, who survived the horrors of the Soviet regime in Russia and eventually emigrated to Canada via Paraguay. Thanks to the Tales team of Conrad Stace and David Klippenstein for their help with the show. I'm your host, Dan Dick. Thanks for listening.